Well, hello and welcome everyone. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Tal Howard, and I direct the Center for Faith and Inquiry here. And if you're unfamiliar with our outfit, there's some literature out in the atrium. And I want to be very brief. I just have three things to say, and then I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Gregor Thuswaldner. But first, just because of the generosity of an outside donor, we have an opportunity to have Peter Berger with us here again. He was here a few years ago, and I enjoyed a conversation with him at that point. As a scholar, it's hard not to judge other scholars and divide them between minnows and fish. Minnows who really don't know, but maybe don't know what they're talking about, and fish. But there's a third category called creatures from the deep. People who have just extraordinary intellectual breadth and reach, and Peter Berger is in that select company. As some of you might know, maybe not many of you, both my colleague Dr. Thuswaldner and Berger are of Austrian background, and I think this is by far the most prominent intellectual exchange of Austrian Americans in Gordon College's history. So you're witnessing history here. So prominent, in fact, it's attracted the attention of Washington, D.C. Not the surveillance part of that, but we have with us Mr. Andreas Polacek, who is the cultural counselor and director of the Austrian Cultural Forum. And if we could just give him right here, stand up and give him and in terms of the format today, this has been billed as a two-part session. Dr. Thuswaldner is going to be interviewing Dr. Berger the first hour about his career and how his views have changed over the years, or perhaps stayed the same. And then there'll be a time for just a very little stretch break. If you need to leave at that point, welcome others in, and we'll let our two speakers catch their breath. And then at 5 o'clock, the conversation is going to be on Religion, the West, and the World, circa 2013. I worried that might be a little narrow, but we'll see. We'll see how the two speakers handle that. And also, I've been asked to say that we have a number of Dr. Berger's books right outside, and they're a 20% markdown. So feel free to look at some of those. And then there's going to be an interview for about 30 or 40 minutes. Is that right? Something like that. And then Dr. Thuswaldner is just going to field questions from the audience in the last 20 or so minutes of each session. And there should be roving mics on the side. So I'll let our two speakers take it away.
Thank you, Tal. Why would a humanities professor interview a world-famous social scientist? Well, the answer is quite simple, because Tal Howard asked me to. And he's the director of the Center for Faith and Inquiry, and I'm a fellow in the center. He's the director, and I'm a fellow in the center. And so, I couldn't say no, even though I'm officially on sabbatical this semester. But that's only part of the answer. The reason why I interrupted my sabbatical in order to host Professor Berger has to do with my own scholarly interest in the many projects he has been working on for more than 5 decades. My first book project, a co-edited collection of essays, looked at how modernity impacted religion as mirrored in 20th and 21st century German and Austrian literature. In our book, we came to the conclusion that God may not be fully alive in the literary texts under discussion, but he was certainly not dead either. Hence, we gave the volume the title Der untote Gott, the undead God. Even though Professor Berger may be best known, especially for this audience, for his many, many contributions to the field of sociology of religion, it would be a mistake to reduce Professor Berger's research to the interplay of religion and modernity. I could read the quite lengthy entry on Wikipedia on Professor Berger, but I trust you could read it yourself. By the way, someone at Princeton copied the entry on her website, housed on the Princeton server, citing it as a Wikipedia source. So I'm assuming it's quite good. Let me just highlight some of the many milestones in Professor Berger's work. Of course, one must mention his groundbreaking book, The Social Construction of Reality, co-authored with Thomas Luckmann, which became one of the 5 most
Who, by the way, is also an Austrian.
Also an Austrian, my goodness. Those Austrians. Which became one of the 5 most influential sociology books of the 20th century. Other important books by Professor Berger include The Invitation to Sociology, The Sacred Canopy, and many, many others. But one needs to also point out his studies on economics and society and the fact that in 1985, he became the director of the Institute for the Study of Economic Culture at Boston University, which, because of the wish of a donor, is now known as the Institute on Culture, Religion, and World Affairs. But there's another reason why I feel honored to host Peter Berger here at Gordon. In 2006, and I'm not sure if you remember that, but in 2006 I attended an event at Boston University co-sponsored by the Viennese Institute of Human Sciences, which at that time had somewhat of an outpost at Boston University, of course, because of Christoph Michalski. The event focused on the role religion plays in Europe. When someone in the audience talked about evangelicals as ignorant and staunch supporters of neoconservative ideology, Professor Berger made the point that evangelicals should not be seen as a politically monolithic group. After the discussion, I personally thanked Professor Berger for setting the record straight, and he invited me to lunch next day. I connected with him personally because of the fact that both of us are converts to Lutheranism, and both of us were born in Austria. Professor Berger's Austria, of course, was quite different from the Austria I grew up in. Born in a family with Jewish roots, Peter Berger's family was able to escape from Austria in 1938, the year Hitler made Austria part of the Third Reich. Even though Professor Berger was trained as a sociologist in the US and he writes his articles and books predominantly in English, he has kept in close touch with Austria and especially Vienna. His German has a Viennese flavor, and I would also argue his wit is Viennese too. I'm particularly pleased that Professor Berger is on our campus today and at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary tomorrow, and he will be back with us and also at the seminary in the spring. I'm very thankful to Professor Berger that he has agreed to publish our conversations in book form, as I'm convinced that there are many more people, well beyond McDonald Auditorium, interested in Professor Berger's life and work. So it's a real pleasure to have Professor Berger here with us this afternoon. Please help me welcome Dr. Berger. When we thought about the name for this event, tell Howard...
But, Gregor, I think I should say something in response to your introduction.
Please, sorry.
So, let me first, a slight correction. I hesitate to say that I was converted to Lutheranism. That gives the wrong impression. I drifted into Lutheranism. It's a different issue. It wasn't a conversion. Beyond that, I appreciate your very generous and flattering comments. And when I'm introduced that way, I always feel I should sort of shuffle my feet and say something, oh shucks, not little old me, humble thing. And then I remember something that the late Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir is supposed to have said to one of her staff, don't be so humble, you're not that important. I didn't want to interrupt you. But.
Thank you. I guess you get the wit, right? All right, so when we were thinking about how to name this event, Professor Howard actually came up with a very good title. He said, well, why not name it after the blog that Professor Berger has on the American Interest website? And so that's why we named it Religion and Other Curiosities. And so as Professor Howard said, we will discuss with Professor Berger some of the things that, some ways how he's changed his thinking over the years, and maybe not. In the first part, we'll have a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back and discuss religion today. So let me begin with the first question. When you started out as a sociologist of religion, you had a very different view of secularization than today. Can you tell us about the concept, the so-called secularization thesis, and what it's about, and why you now think it's wrong?
Okay, Gregor, that was your first question. You sent it to me. Very good question. The best question you could ask. And we could now start a 10-hour lecture on this by me. Instead, I'll give you a 4-minute summary. Secularization theory is a term that was used in the 50s, 60s by a number of social scientists and historians. Basically, it had a very simple proposition. It could be stated in one sentence. Modernity inevitably produces a decline of religion. When I started out doing sociology of religion, like 200 years ago, everyone else had everyone had this idea. And I more or less assumed it was correct. It wasn't a completely crazy assumption. There are many reasons why people said that. But it took me about 20 years to come to the conclusion that the data don't support this. And other people came to the same conclusion. And I would say there are now some holdouts whom I respect. I like people who say something else from what the majority has to say in the field. It shows character. But most people came to the same conclusion as me. The world today is not heavily secularized, with two interesting exceptions that have to be explained. One is geographical, it's Western and Central Europe, and the other is an international intellectual class that is heavily secularized. Why this is something that can be studied, it has been studied, but I won't go into this. The rest of the world is massively religious. In some areas of the world, more religious than ever. The theory is wrong. Now, to conclude that the theory is wrong is the beginning of a new process of thinking. And I came to the conclusion some years ago that to replace secularization theory to explain religion in the modern world, we need a theory of pluralism. Modernity does not necessarily produce secularity. It necessarily produces pluralism, by which I mean what most people mean, the coexistence in the same society of different worldviews and value systems. That changes the status of religion. It's a challenge for every religious tradition. But it's not the challenge of secularity, it's a different tradition. Since you mentioned the death of God, modernity, the problem of modernity is not that God is dead, as some people hoped and other people feared. There are too many gods, which is a challenge, but a different one. So this has been, in terms of my career as a sociologist of religion, has been my major change of mind. And I think it's very useful. In intellectual history, we've learned this, I think, from Thomas Kuhn. You know his structure of scientific revolutions. When one theoretical paradigm collapses under the weight of evidence, it opens up the possibility of new paradigms. And that's very exciting. And that's what I and some other people have been much involved in the last few years.
Thank you. Now, when it comes to Europe, you mentioned Europe as being different. What makes Europe different? Why is Europe not as religious as other places in the world?
Well, look, it's something that one should never do, and that is quote one's own works. It's rude. It's self-aggrandizing. But I have to. I did a book on this with Grace Davey, a British sociologist, who I think is one of the best sociologists of religion in the world. She's a professor at the University of Exeter, and incidentally, among other things, a lay canon of the Church of England. A canon in Anglican Church is an advisor to a bishop, and most of them are clergy, but she's a lay canon. Anyway, we, after much discussion, came to the conclusion there were 8 reasons why Europe is different from the United States. I can't go through that whole list. I would assume generally that any important social or historical event doesn't have a single cause. But among the reasons why Europe is different, I would say the most important reason has to do with relations of church and state. Every major tradition in Europe, Catholic, Protestant, and Eastern Orthodox, comes out of a history of being a state church. Okay? Some exceptions, very nonconformists in England, but most of them Reformed, Lutheran, Catholic, Orthodox. This has de Tocqueville understood this. The United States started out with pluralism. Some of them didn't like this at all. The Puritans in New England hanged Quakers on Boston Common. They weren't tolerant of other religions. They had to become tolerant because there were too many of these other people. You couldn't hang them all, you couldn't convert them all. Okay, it was, I think, a very good development. Look, what does state church do in terms of people's attitudes to religion? If a church is too closely linked to the state, every time people get annoyed at the state, they get annoyed with the church that is established by the state. Very simple. And that's not good for religion, and it's not good for the state, for different but similar reasons. That's the most important reason, I think.
And when it comes to the intellectual elite?
That's more complicated. It's a particular kind of elite. It's the top of that elite are people mostly in the social sciences and humanities. Natural scientists are not so much in that groove. The problem, and I think it has to do with, again, it has to do with pluralism. It has to do with the relativization of worldviews and values, which are most conscious to intellectuals who are in literature or sociology or anthropology or history, rather than chemists, let's say, or physicists who are not much affected by this relativization. I think an explanation can be made along those lines.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that this is obviously the world today, but do you think this is going to change? Or do you anticipate that the elite, the intellectual elite, will remain mainly secular? Do you see any changes? Do you see any changes going on right now? Is there any hope?
Well, the most massive change is in the Muslim world. And we're very often, Turkey is a wonderful example. Turkey had a very secularist regime for many decades. When it became more democratic, all the so-called unenlightened masses started to vote, and they voted their values. But you still have a Kemalist elite, which is very secularist and very disturbed by what is going on. You get increasingly young people, college graduates, university graduates, young intellectuals, who, if they are women, appear at home with the kerchiefs, and if they are men, with the beards, to the utter consternation of their parents. So that's a significant change. So you get now intelligentsia in Muslim-majority countries, which is heavily Islamic, or even Islamist in a radical sense. In the United States, I don't see any remarkable change. The so-called atheist thing is, I think, a public relations creation of certain publishing houses. We can talk about the people who say they have no religious affiliation. Most of them report that they pray regularly, they believe in God and life after death. Basically, these are mostly people who haven't found a church they like, which is a different issue from secularization. I don't anticipate any great changes in the United States. In Europe, it's a difficult question. And there are some hints here and there of a change toward at least a more, even among intellectuals, a more tolerant attitude toward religion. And then you have a very important factor, which is immigration. Mm-hmm. So take Sweden, which is a kind of paradise for secularism. Still, well, these secular Swedes who thought that their worldview was, absolutely obvious, suddenly are confronted with African Pentecostals, with Muslims, and this is having some effect on the indigenous white population of the country. Mm-hmm. This may change in Europe. There are no dramatic changes happening.
Well, about almost 20 years ago, Mark Noll, the historian, wrote a book, The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind, and back then in the mid-90s he complained that there was not much of an evangelical mind, but I think you could make the argument that, especially in the last 20 years, things have changed quite a bit, especially among evangelicals and other Christian institutions and so forth. I wouldn't call it necessarily a revival, even though that would be a typical evangelical word to use, but I think there has been a renewal, intellectual renewal. Do you think that that will be visible on a much larger scale at some point?
Yes, probably not dramatically, but significantly. And Look, this is not my community. I'm evangelisch, but not evangelical. I usually describe, I'm incurably Lutheran. But I'm very comfortable with evangelicals. And between evangelicals and mainline Protestants, I prefer evangelicals for reasons theologically, which I can tell you if you're interested. But speaking as a sociologist, yes, you pointed something which is very interesting, which is a development in recent decades of a self-conscious evangelical intelligentsia. Not only in institutions like this, and there's a network of these institutions across the country with some very significant people. You mentioned Mark Knoll. He's respected not just by evangelicals, but as a historian. But also dispersed in other situations, not just Christian colleges. That's a significant change. And I think an interesting, by the way, an interesting parallel is what happened to Jews in the 1930s, when suddenly places like Harvard and Princeton that were closed to Jews suddenly had an influx of very bright, ambitious young Jewish professors and students, graduate students. Something similar is happening here, I think. These young, bright evangelicals are invading old fortresses of like Harvard or Princeton that you look down on evangelicals. Significant change. The interesting question is, how will this affect the evangelical community as it becomes more, well, educated, more respected, less marginal? So far, well, it was about 20 years ago, you must know this, James Hunter wrote this book, The New Evangelical, something like, which he predicted evangelicals would, in a generation or so, become like other Protestants, as boring as Congregationalists, let's say. That has not happened, at least not yet. So prediction is very dangerous. What I would predict is there will be some effect of this. And there are some aspects where evangelicalism collided with general views of what the world is like. Evolution is an obvious example. But that will not, I think, so far as yet has not influenced the core of evangelical faith. And I don't see this happening yet. The future, one never knows.
Maybe let's switch from, well, evangelicalism to maybe mainline Protestantism. In a book that you wrote in the early 1970s, The Sacred Canopy, you say that Protestantism has significantly contributed to the secularization of the West. And there's a quote actually in the book that says, and I quote, "At the risk of some simplification, it can be said that Protestantism divested itself as much as possible from the three most ancient and most powerful concomitants of the sacred: mystery, miracle, and magic. This process has been aptly caught in the phrase disenchantment of the world. The Protestant believer no longer lives in a world ongoingly penetrated by sacred beings and forces." Could you elaborate on that, how Protestantism might have contributed to secularization?
Well, unoriginal idea. This was Max Weber. Max Weber's term.
Right.
You quoted,
Yes.
disenchantment of the world. Yes, there's something to that. And if you're particularly, I mean, Protestantism cannot be understood except against the Catholic background from which it came. And Catholicism, certainly, even today, has more mystery, magic, and miracle than most Protestants. That's true. It's not true, for example, when you talk about Pentecostals, which is the most rapidly exploding form of Protestantism. And to some extent, it isn't even true of most evangelicals. So I would be more careful now in formulating this.
Would you say this would be true for mainline Protestantism then? Not for
No. And that's, I would say, a significant difference. And incidentally, since it's a Christian college, I don't mind making theological statements. At my age, I can say anything. Why do I care? I think that evangelicals so far have resisted what has been, I think, the main sin. I won't call it a sin, the main mistake of mainline Protestantism, which is to replace the core of the gospel which has to do with the cosmic redefinition of reality, with either politics or psychology, or a kind of vague morality, which is not what I think the Christian gospel is basically about. Christian gospel is about a tectonic shift in the structure of the universe, focused on the events around the life of Jesus. Obviously, a lot of implications to this. Evangelicals have not gone through this process of, Luckmann many years ago called it inner secularization. Either it becomes politicized, what is Christianity all about? It's some political program, tends to be left of center. Now it could just as well be right of center. That's a distortion. Or it becomes psychologized. It has to do with well-being and self-realization, Norman Vincent Peale type stuff. Or a kind of vague morality, which is usually something that most people I would certainly approve of. Don't be nasty to little old ladies if they slip in the gutter. Okay, fine. But again, that's not what the gospel is about. And that is something that evangelicals have retained, and I think, and I would say I hope, will continue to retain.
Let's go back to how your views have changed over the years, and also how the field of sociology has changed over the years. What are some of the questions researchers were particularly interested in the latter half of the 20th century compared to now?
What, scholars of religion?
Yes, scholars of sociology of religion. That is, how has the field changed?
Well, here I have to become very pessimistic. I'm sorry. Look, sociology of religion has been influenced by the trajectory of sociology in general. And I would say sociology has degenerated because of two diseases, which appear separately and often are combined. One, which started in the 50s, I call the fetishism of methodology. Basically, it means nothing which you cannot quantify and feed into a computer to come out with statistics isn't real. Now, I'm not against this kind of method. It's extremely important. If you want to know how several million Americans think about something, there's no alternative to survey research. But when sociology simply concerns itself with phenomena that can be readily quantified, it loses the big questions. That's a disease that began in the 50s. The other disease began 10 years later, more or less, and it's ideologization of sociology. Sociology became a propaganda instrument for various, invariably in the United States, invariably left of center or countercultural causes. Again, there are survey data on this. How many sociologists vote for left liberal Democrats as against Republicans? Basically a range of 500 to 3, I'm slightly exaggerating. How many members of the American Sociological Association vote for Republican candidates? Well, we have data, not too many, to put it briefly. I'm not making a political statement. Maybe one should vote for liberal Democrats, that's not the issue. But sociology has then been sucked into the effect of this political revolution within the field, which means, take something very important, very close to me. My wife, who's also a sociologist, is a family sociologist. She's done, I think, interesting work on family sociology. That field has disappeared. Now we have gender studies, women's studies, queer studies, studies of queer, black, feminine women. It's the family as an object of research has disappeared. And you could say the same thing of sociology of religion. So if you ask me, nothing terribly interesting has been happening in the sociology of religion. There are some very good people, and I wouldn't hesitate to name them, both in Europe and in the United States. But it's pretty marginal in terms of the field.
Okay. Now, what have been some of the biggest surprises for you when it comes to the intersection of religion and society? When you look back at the last 5 decades or so, have there been developments that you didn't anticipate?
Well, I would say if you go back to I'm so old now, I forget what happened when. But if you go back few decades, my main surprise was I discovered Pentecostalism as a significant sociological problem. It's not a religious format that particularly appeals to me, but as a sociologist, I find it enormously significant. And our research center has done a number of studies. In fact, we pioneered in the study of Pentecostalism. And we first supported the work of David Martin, another British sociologist, sort of the dean of sociology of Pentecostalism now. He's my generation. He still has interesting things to say. That's been a big surprise. And,
can you elaborate on the surprise a little bit? What was so surprising about that particular religious group?
its size and the rate of growth. I would say Pentecostalism is the fastest growing religious movement in history. I mean, the Pentecostal core phenomena, speaking in tongues, spiritual healing, miracles, exorcism, have been around for many years, always around in Christian history. Modern Pentecostalism, most historians would agree, it would date from the beginning of the 20th century. A crucial event was the so-called Azusa Street Revival, 1906, when a one-eyed black Baptist preacher came from Kansas to Los Angeles and started preaching in an abandoned stable on Azusa Street, kind of slum. He must have been quite a character. And within a few months, he assembled, in German, als zusammengepredigt. He managed by his preaching to bring together a congregation that was interracial, very unusual for California. And it spread from there. First other place in the United States, then abroad. The Pew Research Center a few years ago did a study on world Pentecostalism. These figures are very iffy, but it's very solidly based, the study. They estimated about 600 million Pentecostals in the world today. That is amazing. And this I didn't know when I started out. I knew what Pentecostalism was. I'd come across it here and there, but the size of the phenomenon, I didn't know. And also its enormous influence, economically and politically, especially, of course, in the global south. The United States, it's a little different. It's been around a long time. It's not as important, but in Black Africa, Latin America, and parts of Asia, it's terribly important. I didn't know this until later, not later than my beginnings.
You've written so many books, it's really hard to keep track.
But I apologize.
Thank you. There's one book that fascinated me that came out just a couple of years ago on fundamentalism and relativism and finding a different position, a middle position between the two extremes. How do you explain that both fundamentalism and relativism are so popular in the 21st century?
I would say they are two sides of the same coin. What pluralism brings about in the area of religion is that in fewer and fewer places in the world is there one religious tradition which is taken for granted. It has a sort of hegemonic or monopoly status in society. So let us say 200 years ago, if you lived in a, look around, I think of Austria, okay. If you lived in a Tyrolean village 200 years ago, to be a Catholic was as natural as to, you were born that way, as you had blonde hair or red hair or were allergic to, I don't know, some pollen. That is very difficult now to find in the world. You have to go into the center of Amazonia or Central Africa to find such tribes. And even in very remote areas, you find all kinds of pluralism. I could give you many colorful examples. Okay. What does this mean for the individual? It means that instead of the religion into which he or she was born is self-evidently true, now you have to make choices. Okay? You can be this or you can be that. And even if you choose a very conservative version of your own tradition, say a very conservative kind of Catholicism, you've made that choice. And that by implication means you could make a different choice tomorrow. It becomes more precarious. Now, many people can live with this. I have no particular problem with this, frankly. But some people find this very unsettling, and one can understand this. Human beings have want some certainty in life. Well, both relativism and fundamentalism are ways of reducing that anxiety. The fundamentalist tries to, and but the secular fundamentalisms too, not just religious fundamentalisms. The message of any fundamentalist movement to its potential recruits is, look, come and join us. We'll give you what you always wanted, certainty. You'll know what the world is like. You'll know who you are. You would learn how to live. You will know how to live. We'll teach you. Okay. Relativism embraces the uncertainty and says, don't worry that you don't know what is true and what is right and what is wrong. There are no objective standards. Everything is relative. And basically, you decide your own worldview. That's in a way the opposite of fundamentalism, but it has the same psychological function. The middle ground is that you don't give way to the fundamentalist promise, whatever it may be, political, religious, whatever. You accept the fact that there are many uncertainties in the world. And on the other hand, you don't accept the proposition that we don't know at all what is true or what is right or wrong. That is a middle position, which I would say is not that unusual. And there are millions of people in the world, now I'm being optimistic again, but I think it's correct, who manage this in their own lives.
So they're trying to live those tensions.
Who manage the tension?
Mm-hmm. And what I like about that particular book is it's a collection of essays too, and you invited
different religious traditions.
Yes,
yeah.
Colleagues from different traditions to talk about how they would formulate their own middle ground, so to speak. I recently had a conversation with a German Catholic theologian who was shaking his head when I mentioned to him that the denominational boundaries are breaking down in the United States, that one could grow up Baptist, attend a Mennonite college, and become a member of a Nazarene church, marry a Reformed person, and send their kids to an Episcopal school. This may be a little bit of an exaggeration, but maybe not too far from reality. How is it possible that denominational boundaries and the different theological frameworks they're supposed to provide seem to have lost their relevance? Was that foreseeable 50 years ago?
It was beginning then, and I think one reason is that the dogmatic formulations of different religious traditions are still meaningful in describing in broad outlines what the tradition is still about, but professional theologians take it much more seriously than most people in the pews. Mm. Take a very concrete example. A friend of mine who's a Lutheran theologian was very involved in this. It took several years. They had a committee of theologians that tried to reconcile Lutheran and Roman Catholic views of the Eucharist. No, excuse me, of justification. Mm-hmm. Justification. And after years of negotiation, all I'm sure in comfortable hotels in Germany or Switzerland or wherever, they arrived at the formula that both sides could accept. Most people, lay people, couldn't care less. They didn't know what the original dogmatic formulations were, and they were not concerned about finding compromises. In a nasty moment, I called many such negotiations border negotiations between non-existing countries. Okay. Okay, let's stay with the Lutheran Catholic example. Let me give another example, not to talk all the time about Lutherans. There's an interesting Catholic Orthodox dialogue going on, again, between theologians. And some of them have agreed that basically they agree on so many things. They're really the same, you know. Well, they leave out the political aspect of this, but even from the point of view of the average believer, if you spend 10 minutes at the Divine Liturgy in an Orthodox church and 10 minutes in a Roman Catholic Mass, you understand these are totally different pieties. Okay? And whatever the theologians have decided is the same, the little old babushka who kisses the icon knows that what she does is different from the Catholics down the road. So I think in answer to your question, the denominational divisions are basically defined theologically, and for most lay people, the theological distinctions are not terribly real.
Good. That's a good explanation. So next time I meet my friend, I have a good answer for him why this is possible. Very good. Now we have some time for members of the audience to ask questions, and there should be microphones out there for you, so you can ask questions.